Hey, it's Larson here for ADSR, and today I want to talk about future-based snares, how you can make your snare stand out from the mix and make it so bright and, in the face and very punchy and very powerful, because it is not always an easy thing. Now, I collected you 5 tips to make your snare stand out pretty well in your mix. Most of these tips are not those tips what you would expect, because my first tip is you need to pick the right sample. So most of you guys, I know because I talked about a lot of newbies and a lot of, experienced producers too, that they are searching for the magic plugin to make your sloppy and low quality snare stand out in the mix. To apply transient shaping and EQ, compression, etc. But it just won't work. If your sample is low quality, it just won't work. You don't want to mess around, an hour to improve your low quality snare. You probably need to find another sample. Now, my points on picking the right sample is, you need a high pitch snare. This is a little song I made. And the snare itself is, I would say it's pure gold. And it is only because, it has the best balance between the lows, the middle frequencies and the highs, especially for this particular style, the future bass style. Now, it needs to be high pitch. And why is that? Because future bass is a very bright style with lots of highs, lots of middle frequencies. So your snare should be something like that, to stand out. You can't use a snare with lots of low frequencies because, it was just lost in the mix. So you really need to pick a high pitch snare. And of course you want to layer it up with a reverb clap, because if you pick a snare and just pitch it up, you will still need that middle frequencies. So what I like to do here is I like to layer it up with a reverb clap or an acoustic snare, but always be careful with the reverb length. What I like to do is apply a reverb, compress it pretty heavily and bounce it into audio and chop off the tail. It always works and you don't need to mess around with automating the reverb tails and compression and other. So once you have the layer, you want to compress the layered acoustic snare together. And what I also like to do is apply a transient shaper. If you follow these steps, you will be able to create a very nice sounding snare, which will cut through the mix. So you need to find a bright layer, a bright acoustic snare or clap, and your transient on the high pitch snare should be really punchy and really bright too. This was my first tip, to pick the right sample. My second tip is to sidechain the snare. Now, as I experienced, most of you sidechain only the kick with the instruments and especially with the sub, but as I experienced, the most important part here is, to make room for your snare. And this is why I would say sidechain other instruments, especially the sub with the snare. Because if you don't sidechain and don't duck the sub when the snare hits, it will just kill all the transient. It will subtract the energy from the snare, subtract the tension, and subtract everything what you really want to need if you want to make your snare stand out. So this is very important. Sidechain that snare. My third tip is about the color of your snare. As I mentioned before, you need to pick and you need to, create a snare which is really bright, because future bass is a very bright style. So with lots of bright sounds, with lots of high frequencies and stuff. So be careful, pick the right snare, especially pick a very bright snare with lots of high and lots of middle frequencies. My fourth tip to make your snare stand out is never ever apply a limiter on the drums group. It's just a very silly idea, because a limiter always kills transients. Of course, you may use a fab filter limiter, which offers different saturations and stuff to keep the transients on your sound, but as experience, it's not really important. What you really want to do is add the saturator first on the drum group and then limiter. So this is all. You don't need too much. Of course, you can add the transient master on the drums group. You can do that, and in Ableton Live then we have that wonderful new plugin, which is called the Drums Bus. And what it does to the transients is just pretty crazy. I pretty love it. So pull up the dump, because you don't want to lose the higher frequencies, and push out the transients, and boom, it creates wonderful transients. So never ever put a limiter on the drums. Okay, so compress, saturate and limit only at the end of the chain on your master. So you don't want to lose any of your beautiful bright transients. If your sound is clean and shiny, you really want your transients to be shiny too, especially on the snare, because the snare is the most important part in every halftime style, like dubstep, future bass, trap, and everything like that. So this was my fourth tip. Never ever use a limiter on the drum group. And my fifth tip is it is always a good idea to keep the snare in 2 layers in your drums group. So 1 layer for the lower snare, which sounds this in my example. So this is how it sounds. And also I applied a brighter and also very heavily compressed reverb layer, which sounds like this. And all together they sound something like this. This little snare on itself won't be able to cut through the mix, so you really want that very heavily compressed reverby kind of layer with lots of energy on the middles and on the highs. So this is very important, and this is what I experienced during the years. If you want to make your snare stand out, especially in future bass, these tips can be very helpful. If you're a dubstep producer, this thing can be a little different, because you know dubstep doesn't play too much on the middle frequency area. This is why you need to use powerful, especially in the low end kind of snare, because you know dubstep is a very bass heavy kind of style, but future bass is a very bright synth heavy style. So I hope you enjoy these little tips, and see you next time, guys. Bye bye.